Okay, welcome APUSH students to chapter 27. This is the civil rights struggle, so it's a very important chapter. It's not an overly long chapter, but it does have some court cases, a few people that you'll have to make sure that you know. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's get into it. So you see our time period is 1941, which is the beginning of World War II, of course, to 1957, which is probably used as the Interstate Highway Systems Act. All right. Basically, you have more liberalism coming along in this time period, more change that's being supported, belief that the government must protect people from discrimination. I think that World War II is probably the biggest cause for this. When you're out there fighting Hitler, who's done terrible things to Jews, it looks kind of bad if you're doing things that were sort of similar to African Americans back home. So I think that more than anything else, World War II is the most important thing for the civil rights movement. All right. So, what was life like under Jim Crow in the South? As you know, there were a lot of laws uh, limiting life for blacks in the South. They couldn't marry whites, separate movie theaters, separate water fountains, things like that. Their voting rights have been taken away, stripped away through poll taxes and literacy tests. They had white primaries, which basically meant that every person that you could vote for had to be white, which also discouraged African Americans from voting because they don't feel like these white people are going to support them in any way. Housing in the North was very heavily segregated. Although it was official policy in the South, you had kind of a natural segregation going on in the North. Violence was used to discourage blacks from living in white neighborhoods. So, and that's in the North. So it's not just a Southern thing. Even in the North, all the African Americans who had migrated to the North for jobs during World War I and World War II, many would say it's still better than the South, but they're also finding out that they are certainly not seen as equal there. And again, origins of the civil rights movement, it kind of goes back to the whole Nazi racism stuff. Nobody wants to look like Hitler. All right, now going back again to the beginning of World War II, you had a very important civil rights movement leader, A. Philip Randolph, who threatened to march on Washington for better wages and better working conditions for African Americans. He wanted them to have opportunities to get jobs in the defense industries, which they weren't getting. They were basically just getting the lowest of the low jobs. FDR discourages him, says we're in a war, we're in a major war, we don't need this. But Randolph will not back off. And so he is able basically to pressure FDR into issuing Executive Order 8802. So you should remember this, very important. It's a very important victory for civil rights. And that executive order is going to bar discrimination in defense industries. Now, it's a good step. There's still going to be discrimination. It's one of those things where it's hard to enforce all the time, but it is a major victory for the black community without a doubt. The Double V campaign comes into being. We want to get victory over fascism abroad and racism at home. So make sure you understand the Double V campaign. Pretty simple. Fascism abroad and racism at home. Okay. Cold War civil rights. So a little bit later, we're after, right after the World War II, of course. To secure these rights, government report under Truman's administration that advocated government involvement to ensure equality for blacks. A good thing that Truman's administration does is he is a voice for the African American community, and for the military, he's going to, very importantly, desegregate the military. He thinks it's silly that that we fought in segregated units during World War II. So that's Executive Order 9981, desegregation of the United States military. So from that point on, every military conflict that the United States goes into is going to be fought with desegregated units. And I think that's going to do a lot to bridge the gap between black and white worlds, because there's a close bond, a brotherhood amongst soldiers. And when you've basically got blacks and whites in the same foxhole, well, that's, it's going to help build bridges between these two different cultures. All right. The Korean War was the first war fought with desegregated units. Korean War is going to run from 1950 to 1953. You get basically a push against this from, Truman is a Democrat, but you get a split in the Democrat Party, a very important one that you need to know. And you get a racist group. I mean, you might argue they're all racist, but they're some levels more racist than others in the Democrats. And that is the Dixiecrats, who are led by Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond's going to run for president, but he's not going to win. And as you can imagine, the Dixiecrats' platform is to keep the South white. Whites in control. They don't want desegregation in any shape, form, or fashion. But they will not get victory. All right. So, what was the civil rights? Now, the civil rights is more. It's not just African Americans. Other minority groups such as Mexican Americans and Indians as well, Native Americans, are also fighting for rights as well. Mexican Americans face similar discriminations as African Americans. They too had poll taxes, and they also lived in poor, more rundown neighborhoods. The one big name you really need to know with Mexican civil rights was Cesar Chavez, who didn't die that long ago. He died in 1993, but he is almost a saint in the Hispanic community. He was a guy who fought for unionism. He wanted Mexican, and a lot of these Mexicans are working in agricultural, and he wants unionism to protect them. He wants them to get in unions. He had non-aggressive tactics. He's like Martin Luther King Jr. He's like a Gandhi, and he gains nationwide support. He's got that charisma and it factor, and he's going to be pretty successful for Mexican Americans. You get a very important court case, 1947, just 2 years after World War II, Mendez versus Westminster, which desegregates Mexican schools. That's important. African American schools have not been desegregated yet, but this is going to, set the precedent for that. So they're going to desegregate Mexican schools. You get another very important African American figure, and that's Thurgood Marshall, who becomes the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court. In this time period, he's an NAACP lawyer who will later on advance up the ranks. Important court case here: Smith versus Allwright, 1944, right towards the end of World War II, and this is going to bar white primaries. We talked about that earlier, where where you can have a primary with only white candidates. This was something like that was going on in response to things in Texas and other southern states where they were only allowing white people to run for office. The lead attorney, Thurgood Marshall, was the lead attorney in one of the most important court cases in American history, which was Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, 1954, which is going to be the desegregation of schools, where whites and blacks they'll have to take all black schools and integrate them with white schools. This is going to cause a lot of issues, some close to home, such as the Little Rock Crisis in 1957. This comes roughly 7 years after Mexican Americans were allowed to go to white schools. And there's always a connection with this court case and another court case that we had earlier in the year, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, which said that separate is equal. Brown versus Board of Education, you should know, says separate is not equal. It is inherently unequal. Extreme resistance by Southerners to this. Some of them are losing their minds. It's embarrassing. We're going to watch plenty of video evidence over this. Whites are distraught that their children will have to go to school with African Americans. It is blowing their minds, and they are going to picket. They are going to protest. There's going to be quite a bit of violence. All right. One of the leading anti-segregation people is Bull Connor. and he's from Alabama. He ordered the police to use force against protesters. Um, Now with Bull Connor, who is, uh, he's gonna get the dogs after African Americans who are protesting and stuff. What's important about this time period, very very important about this time period, is the TV. The TV is going to transmit these images across the United States. And there's something about seeing this on TV that begins to change people's minds. I mean, to see African Americans getting blasted off their feet by high powered water cannons, to see the police putting dogs on them, sicking dogs on them, to see this violence play out over the airwaves is very powerful. So the TV plays a large role in helping African Americans gain support for their cause. Martin Luther King Jr. needs no introduction. You're all very well aware of who he was. Remember that he is a preacher. He's a Southern Baptist. He followed in Gandhi's footsteps. He believed in civil disobedience and nonviolence, turn the other cheek. He's not a perfect man. He does have harsh stances against homosexuals, and he does keep mistresses. But his work transcends his failings as a mere man, and he's very, very important for the civil rights movement. However, he is not the only. There are many, many, many white and black players in the movement for civil rights. George Wallace, who was governor in Alabama, tried to prevent black students from attending the University of Alabama, which had been desegregated by Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education. And so he's basically over my dead body kind of thing. You get sort of a military standoff, but that school will be desegregated. The same thing happens in the Little Rock 9 crisis. Little Rock schools are desegregated, and so they take 9 African-American students who are very bright, top of their class, and they integrate them into Little Rock Central. And the governor at the time, Orval Faubus, the Arkansas governor, says he's not going to let them. And so Dwight D. Eisenhower basically takes the Arkansas National Guard and takes control of them and forces them to basically escort these African-American students to and from classes to keep them safe. Again, we'll see videos of basically the hell that these young kids went through on a daily basis as they tried to integrate the school systems in Little Rock. All right. 1963 to 65, we're in our last 2 years of, really the main parts of the civil rights movement. Freedom Summer. You get SNCC and CORE and the NAACP and the SCLC. All these are African-American movements. They helped register voters in 1964 because they're about to win their votes back. They're trying. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sought to attend the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, but the convention did not recognize the party made up of African Americans, and so they were left out. But time's ticking, and they're up against the wall. And we get Selma and the Voting Rights Act. Bloody Sunday was the attack of marchers from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama by state troopers. Again, we'll see some video on this. It's pretty shocking, fairly embarrassing to watch the treatment of African Americans in these things. And so eventually this is going to help lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is going to give African Americans the right to vote. And so that's going to help change a lot of things. All right. So we got the right to vote. African Americans had the right to vote 1965. What comes next? And again, I told you that there were more African American leaders than just Martin Luther King Jr. One of the most famous and very opposite of Martin Luther King Jr. was Malcolm X. And he is in line with what's called Black nationalism, which is complicated. The meanings behind it are complicated, but it means pride to be Black, but it's also separate. where Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned an integrated society, nationalism and Malcolm X, they don't see that. They don't see that these two these two races can ever get along, and so they want their own places, their own space, if you will. They want, they're trying to get African Americans to buy from only black businesses and things like that, support blacks in every endeavor. Now, Malcolm X eventually joins the Nation of Islam, which is a lot more radical group. So you have a lot of things here. You have Martin Luther King Jr., who's a Protestant. You've got Malcolm X and the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, who are Muslim. And theirs is a much more violent approach than Martin Luther King Jr.'s is. And it becomes very popular amongst African Americans in cities, which makes sense. Remember that cities are more liberal and country is more conservative. It's not just for whites, that's for blacks as well. Malcolm X urged violence for self-defense, not a turn the other cheek. He basically says if a white man hits you, you hit him back harder. But Elijah Muhammad, used Malcolm X in the early days, but Malcolm X became more popular, more well-known than Elijah Muhammad, who had a lot of jealousy because of that. And, Malcolm X goes on his Hajj, his pilgrimage to the Middle East, and he sees that it's possible for African Americans to get along with other races, and it changes his mind and his vision on some things. And when he comes back, he basically splits away from the Nation of Islam, and that doesn't go very well for him. The Nation of Islam will order his assassination, and he will be murdered on February 21st, 1965. All right, we get some more black nationalism under the Black Panther Party. Founded in 1966 by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, urged among African Americans in pursuit of self-defense, so more of the same. They're going to be basically a militant group. You're going to see pictures of them in guns, and they're just very take no crap from anybody. They don't see much good amongst white people. Popular in cities, again, much more so than in the countries. But they do focus on community programs. They do some good things for African-American communities to make sure kids are fed and things like that. You get a group similar to the Black Panthers called the Young Lords, which is basically the Puerto Rican version. Puerto Ricans, remember, it's an American territory, and many of them have been coming to America for a while where they've faced discrimination. So they're looking for equality as well. There's a lot of urban violence in the time period. The 60s are very, very troubled. Counterculture, there's a lot of the civil rights movement, the beginnings of Vietnam. The 60s is one of the most troubled periods in American history. In fact, probably 1968 might be one of the worst years in American history, where you got Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated, Bobby Kennedy being assassinated. That's just a lot of chaos right now. You get the Watts riots of 1965. It's a riot that lasts an entire week, and 34 people are killed. And you're going to have several of these race riots. There's famous ones in Oklahoma even. After more riots in 1967, the Kerner Commission investigated the origins of the violence, and they come up with this proclamation. Our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It's sort of like what you see going on now with social media. You see a lot of divisiveness, although you don't see nearly, and you have Black Lives Matters movements and stuff for the last couple of years, but you still don't see nearly the violence that you see in this time period. As for Vietnam, which begins in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. is outspoken against the war. Remember, war units have been desegregated, and what you're going to find is that an unequal distribution of African Americans are going to serve in Vietnam. The percentage of population they represent is not the percentage of African Americans who serve in Vietnam, and you get, a lot of the African American, and a lot of people are against Vietnam, but in the African American community especially. But Lyndon Johnson, who, he has his, he's liberal, he's a Democrat. When he comes into office, he's all about trying to war on poverty, end poverty, and he does some great things. But when Vietnam breaks out, that gains all of his focus, and so that's going to put him at odds at times with the African American community. You get the rise of the Chicano movement. Again, Cesar Chavez. He helps create the United Farm Workers. That's a union. He led a great picker strike to bring attention to the plight of Mexican-American workers. So when you see the name Cesar Chavez, you should automatically go to Chicano movement, to a Mexican-American rights. He's the MLK of the Mexican-American civil rights movement, okay? So keep that in mind. He's going to meet with the president. He's going to do hunger strikes and things like that, similar to what women did in their push for equality. And we got one last group to talk about, and that's the group that has it the worst. It always surprises students that Native Americans live in more poverty than African Americans do, but they do. They face the most challenges of any minority group, stunningly high unemployment, very poor housing, very poor schools with Native Americans. You get some pushes against that. Indians of all tribes and American Indian movement. They use protests to bring attention to their plight. And there's still issues, major issues in the Native American community even today. We most recently had protests against pipeline going through Native American lands, and you had a standoff there. But there are several flare-ups every decade or so in the Native American community who still live in more poverty than any other minority group. The Indians of all tribes would have a big movement in 1969 where they take over Alcatraz Island out in San Francisco, and trying to fight for better rights. Okay, so what you see really with this civil rights movement, focusing on the impact of World War II. You got some major players: A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Cesar Chavez. Those are the biggest names that you need to make sure you know. You have a few court cases, the most important ones being, of course, Brown versus Board of Education. You do get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which are going to get African Americans. It's going to finish all the poll taxes and all those things. And from that point on, African Americans are going to be able to vote. Thurgood Marshall, forgot him. He is a big name as well. Very prominent NAACP lawyer, and becomes eventually the first African American Supreme Court justice. Dixiecrats, make sure you know them. That's led by Strom Thurmond. It's a split in the Democratic Party. It's one of the rare times when a party splits but still wins the presidency, because LBJ is going to win. Or sorry, Truman is going to win. I don't know what I said, LBJ. Truman will win the presidency even though his party has been split. Dixiecrats are looking for all white power in the South. Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. And guys, that's it. Fairly straightforward, fairly simple. Make sure you take great notes off of it, and we'll go into much more detail in class on Monday.